This is a model that came up in the Tuesday lab section that has some issues with, essentially with contact. In attempting to run it, the group found that it would run for a considerable amount of time and ultimately fail out, giving an issue, I believe said something about contact. That's going to be a pretty common issue for a lot of the groups on this project, because you'll tend to have pieces that for manufacturing reasons don't quite join together. In fact, if I zoom in, it's going to be a little tough to see, but you can just make out there that this notch is a bit larger than the actual tab that fits into it. From a manufacturing point of view, that's what you would want, because you want some clearance to allow for ease of assembly. But in the FEA sense, it looks at it and says, well, there's a gap there, I can't join that by default. It does attempt to join some parts when you import it, but it's not going to get everything. And in order to see what it has or has not managed to connect, you can come up here to the connection advisor and go to contact visualization plot. Hit calculate, and it's going to search through all the parts, and anything that it has defined contact on upon import is going to highlight it in red. And in this case, the only things that were being bridged were between these plates, this one and the one below it, and the head tube itself. So everything else is missing contact. So when it tries to run, it just can't actually find those parts and define them. So that's the first thing, is determine where upon importing your model contact is defined. And you should try to do this before you even attempt to run the model, because if it's not correct, it's not going to run. So do this as sort of a first step once you have your model in. Now, once you know there's a problem, you can come under, I believe it's under component contact, global contact. This is defined by default in the model, and or this may have been defined by the student group, I'm not sure, but regardless, what I want to do is I'm going to clear out what's there and add in the entire assembly. Just in one click, I grab every part. It's going to look for contact everywhere now. So if I just accept that, go back to connection advisor and visualize it one more time, it's not helped. It's actually, well, it has helped a little bit. It found some additional contact down on the bottom bracket, but where all of these plates join together, it's done nothing for it. To get that to work, what I'm going to do is come back under the global contact, right click, edit definition, and this is the key right here, this non-touching faces, because there are gaps between many of these parts. It's just not able to identify it. By activating this, you can define how large of a gap you're willing to allow in the model. And so I set it for 15 thousandths. What that means is any gap between two parts below 15 thousandths, it's going to take it as a bonded connection and form contact between it. That's what I want. For this particular model, these side plates were modeled with the sheet metal tool, which makes them show up as shell elements. So I also need to click this on. If you're not sure if you have shell elements or not, just turn it on by default. It's not going to hurt anything. And accept that, and then go back to connection advisor, visualize it one more time, calculate. Now there's a lot more parts in the selection now, so it's going to take a little bit longer to run it. And you get a percentage count down here, and there we go. So now everything looks good. If I come in, the dropouts are joining to the plates. Everything in the bottom bracket is correct. This little side support is bonded to the plate. And all these, I don't know what these are called in the model, head tube brace, that's joined all the way around fully to this plate. The top surface, it's selecting the entire top surface, that's why it's all red, but it's really just bonding right local to the tab right here. It's the only place where it's actually in contact. So I'm reasonably certain this should run now. So what I'm going to do is hit run, and then I'm going to pause the recording. I'm on my office computer, which is pretty slow, so there's no point in you sitting through this. I'll get it running. You can see down here it's processing the sheet metal. Make sure it is going to run. It's meshing it. Generating contacts. Okay, it looks like it's going to run, so I'm going to hit pause right now. Okay, and here it is solved. This is a stress plot. Don't let the brutally deformed shape fool you. That's gross over overextension, what do you call it? The scaling is set really high by default, so it looks absurd, but the actual displacements are much less. In fact, if I go to the displacement plot, why is that in millimeters? 14 millimeters, so it's not a small amount of displacement. There's most definitely some issues going on with this, but it's not as bad as the deformed shape would have you believe. So I won't talk about the results in any detail beyond that. I'll leave that to this group to figure out and discuss. But that basic set of steps is something that most of you probably are likely to need to look into. Anytime you can create your model in such a way that surfaces are immediately adjacent and joined to each other, it can often mesh the parts in such a way that it's joined node to node to node. And that's ideal because it doesn't have to define the contact. That way it can run in a pure linear solution. There's no need for an iterative solution, which contact requires an iterative solution. It just tends to produce cleaner results and a little bit quicker too. But for practical purposes, for most of what you're doing, small gaps and things like that can be set with bonded contact with no particular issue. So the steps again, when you bring your model in, come up here to the visualization plot and calculate where you have contact and, more importantly, where you're missing contact. Once you've identified that there's any issue or some issue or anything of the sort there, then you can come just under your connection sets and define that. And if you don't, if there's nothing there at all by default, you can set those up from scratch too. And if you run into that issue, we can talk about that one-on-one.